very good afternoon. I'm joined by Mothusi. He's the head of dealer sales and marketing non-metro at Standard Bank South Africa. And this is on the issue of the rising demand in Chinese vehicles or for Chinese vehicles. Standard Bank indicating that they're seeing that in their loan book this year, up to about 36% of that is going towards Chinese brands. Thanks very much for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much.
So tell us about the trends that you've been seeing for, demand for Chinese vehicles, both in terms of new vehicle sales and used vehicles, and when you began to see this trend sort of kicking off.
Yeah, so I think we can go as far back as 2022 when we started doing some of the analysis. So in our data sets from the finance vehicles that we've done, in 2022, we were actually sitting at around about 6% of the total sales being Chinese brand. When we conclude our analysis as at end of H1 in 2024, we actually saw the upward trend moving from 6% to 7.4%, and that is based on the overall total sales. However, though, when we then dive deeper looking into the used component of the Chinese brand, we actually saw an increase. In 2022, of the Chinese brands, the split was 20% was sitting on the used and 80% was sitting on the new. However, though, as at end of H1 in 2024, we actually saw that the used component has actually risen from that 20% to 36%. So that in itself, it basically says where we financed 100 vehicles in 2022, 20 of those were actually used. Now in end of H1 in 2024, we actually seen that has increased to 36. So that is actually telling as far as the market is concerned and the really presence of the Chinese brand in South Africa.
So what kind of vehicles or what brands are people going for in terms of Chinese vehicles?
So really that is consumer driven. You will have brands such as GWM Haval, you will have the Cherry, you will have the Bake, and there are some that are getting launched I think as we go along during this month, and subsequently some are entering the market in next year. So we have seen manufacturers such as BYD, we have seen manufacturers such as LDV that are actually coming in and taking advantage of the South African automotive retail market. Yeah.
So what is the appeal of Chinese vehicles? Is it all about price, or is there an element of quality as well? Because of course there's a debate about Chinese vehicles and so on.
So it is a microcosm of things, really, when one looks into it. Because firstly, we can obviously go back to, when you're looking at the Russian and Ukraine war back in 2022, some of the manufacturers were impacted from the microchip perspective. So they were not able to manufacture the vehicles. And there was less impact on the Chinese brands. So that became an alternative from the South African consumer perspective. That's one element. However, the major element that we actually have observed is that the Chinese brands have also partnered with our major retailers that are listed on the JSE. So that in itself brought about the strength as far as the brand sentiment is concerned. And also from the value proposition that they put out, they do back themselves and say in some of our models, we're actually willing to go from mechanical warranty up to 1 million kilometers. So that in itself speaks to the, to the consumer. The other element is really what a consumer might be, terming as a full house. So a vehicle, it comes with, a certain spec, whistles and bells, and I don't have to pay extra. Whereas on some of the manufacturers, that might be coming in as an additional cost. So it becomes that prevalent as far as, the presence in Chinese market is concerned. The other thing I think that we also need to be mindful of is those vehicles that were bought about 3-4 years ago, they actually now having those customers coming into the market, replacing them. And when the minute that you start replacing, you obviously start to increase on the used side as well. Yeah. And I think as a consumer, if you drove one brand and then you go and trade it in, you already have a first feel of that. And you ultimately want to go back and say, let me actually take the newer version of the same. So those are some of the nuances that are actually coming through. And you are rightly saying that, from the pricing perspective, could that be playing a factor? Certainly. I think, there are some articles that we have seen that, from the interest rate perspective, we had about 13 months of high interest rate in the country, right? So at the back of that, it speaks about affordability of the consumer. The disposable income or the money that the consumers are left with are not able to go further. You are not able to stretch. So these Chinese market vehicles, to a certain degree, they might be taking advantage of that. And consumers are then able to say, I'm getting a new vehicle, and as a result, this is where I'm going because I'm able to afford.
Yes.
So yeah, that's among other reasons that you are observing.
Of course, we're talking about Chinese vehicles right now, but in these economic times, do you think the whole idea of brand loyalty is pretty much gone out the window now?
Not necessarily. So I always say it's also consumer dependent. There are those who grew in a family setup, and then that family is geared to a certain brand, right? Because that's what they know. It has served them well. They've seen the longevity of that particular brand. But on the other side, you then have maybe us, the young stars, who are saying, actually, no, I'm going for value for money. And value for money will differ from consumer to consumer. And those are some of the elements why we will then see that, there is a movement from certain brands more gearing towards the Chinese brands from the popularity perspective. The other thing I think that maybe might be making the shift as far as consumer sentiment is when you have, a certain colors. We never had teal as a color. We never had baby blue as a color. We never had those rich green as a color. So those are coming through from some of the manufacturers, and so you're like, okay, that looks all right. That looks cool.
Yeah.
So you almost then look at that and say, I actually want to be part of that. So there are those dynamics that are influencing really the consumers or the move from the brand loyalty. And I think the other aspect as well, as we spoke, is affordability. So where am I able to, to get more for less? And the consumer mindset as well is starting to shift to say, I actually want to move from just having a traditional car, but more into a mobility solution, from moving from point A to point B. That in itself plays another role.
Of course, it's not your business, because ultimately you just want to be able to loan people money and they return it, you get your return on the capital that you've given. But what then does this mean for our traditional local manufacturers of vehicles? Surely that's a bit worrying. We know that, of course, the Chinese demand only accounts for about 10% of the total market. But the issue is that there's a rapid increase in this demand. Do you see there being a threat for the local manufacturers in, say, the next 5 years' time? More so because, our government's just been in China saying, hey, guys, you're making EVs, come to South Africa and help us so that we can, create jobs and, produce EVs here, and maybe you'll have a market here as well. How much of a threat are Chinese vehicles or Chinese car manufacturers to our existing manufacturing base?
Yeah, so I don't see them as a threat per se, Nompu, but what I'm seeing is an alternative solution for South Africa. So in that, when you are a manufacturer of vehicles, one of the things that you have to be mindful of is your manufacturing cost, and the other element is obviously how close are you to the consumer need, right? So it then brings about, from research and development perspective as the manufacturer to say, am I still aligned with what the South African consumer needs today? What sort of caveat can I actually bring? And we do have manufacturers in South Africa like your Mercedes-Benz, your VW, your Toyotas, BMW, Nissans, there are those that are present in the country and many more that are actually coming through. So it creates an element of opportunity, and I think for South Africans as well, it is more of saying, if I do have those that are manufactured locally and those that are coming through via the import system, what sort of cost am I looking at? So that again, it goes back into a price play as far as that is concerned. And I suppose, the benefit that we are now seeing as a country with the, the load shedding having been, I almost want to say, thing of a past, and we hope that it will remain so, right? I think the manufacturers really were impacted that are locally by that, but I am so glad that we have seen that, particular shift there. So that in itself is then going to say, could South Africa then therefore do more? An easy answer is certainly yes, we can definitely do more. Is there going to be a threat? I think the jury is out, but it's all again about what is it that the consumer is looking for, what sort of reliance and does one manufacturer actually beg as far as their product is concerned, and the longevity thereof. And then the other element will obviously be the after sale. From the servicing perspective, how are you servicing your customer? So that becomes another advantage that one of the manufacturers can actually use in order for them to grow their footprint.
Ultimately, it's good news for the consumer, because the more competition there is, then hopefully the better price prospect and other aspects of deals when we're buying cars. Thank you so much, sir, for your time and giving us a sense of what's happening happening in the car manufacturing sector and car sales sector, actually. That was Mothusi Dire. He's the head of dealers, sales and marketing non-metro at Standard Bank South Africa.